So, is heaven a real place? Are there people that are suffering immeasurable torment in the afterlife? And what about people that report distressing near-death experiences? How do we understand those? Maybe you just listened to a near-death video and heard somebody talk about how awful the afterlife was. And what can be said about that? This is a really large topic. There is so much that can be covered, and you can't just listen to one video either by me or one of these other people and think you understand it. There's a lot in the afterlife. We're talking basically about the nature of the next world that we get to go to after this one. It has a lot of different rules. It does not follow what we see here. It's not physical. It isn't bound by time. It's very much like a dreamlike state. It's very much like you would sleep at night and have a series of images and visions inside that tell a story, a narrative of your soul going through different experiences, and that is very much what happens in the afterlife. It is a narrative, it is a story, it is very unique to you, it is entirely specific to what's going on inside you at the moment you're having your near-death experience. And then things are asked of you and questions show up, and then you get to make choices, and then you go to the next state. This is very much phenomenological. I don't believe these people are describing an actual, explicitly real, concrete object called hell or a place called hell. I think they are experiencing images that come from their own internal focus and the things that they believe should be there, or that they expect to be there, or that they're focused on, or that they're hyper-focused on, or preoccupied with. It's kind of like what fills their heart and what fills their mind is what shows up in their near-death experience. And that's actually a biblical concept. There is oftentimes a lot of movement in these stories. They progress from one state to the next, from one experience to the next. And there's themes that unfold in these NDE, these distressing NDEs. They are highly idiosyncratic, which means that they're very unique to the person, and no two NDEs will sound alike. No two NDEs will see the same thing. No two NDEs will describe the same experience or the same phenomenon or the same whatever. It goes on and on, the things that they describe. There are themes to what they describe, but you will never get, oh, this is what hell looks like, or oh, this is what heaven looks like, or oh, this is what, that place looks like. Each person sees it differently. They describe it differently. Now, you can start to describe classes of stories that make sense, and I'm going to try and do that in the next few minutes. There can be a lot of value in these negative NDEs. People come back and can be changed by them in a good way. There can also be no value in them. They could have just been a negative experience, and there isn't really an explanation for it. It just happened, and there wasn't really a lesson in it to be learned. A lot of that has to do with the state you are in when you pass over. If you're in a traumatized state when you pass over, you are more likely to have a negative NDE. But across the board, there isn't really a way of dividing people who have negative from positive NDEs. You can't say, oh, this religion has positive ones and this religion has negative ones. It's like you are just as likely to have a negative one. Well, actually not just as likely, but anyone can have a negative NDE. And I don't want you to be afraid of that. Just know that if you do end up having a negative NDE, it will pass. It's just a story. It will unfold. It will teach you something. Maybe it won't. But you will be given lots of opportunities to keep moving into the next scene. So we'll cover that more in the nature of the afterlife and in the next video about what to do in your NDE so that you end up in a positive place. Okay, let me show you this chart. I think it will be helpful to explaining where we're going to go. Of the people who die, these are people whose brains check out and they flatline. They basically lose all electrical activity in their brain and their heart stops. I would say these are people who flatline. 80% of them come back and tell us nothing. They basically said, I didn't even know I was gone. I just remember falling asleep, or I fainted or something. And 80% of people that get resuscitated from the dead tell us nothing about where they went or what happened. 20% pop out of their bodies and have various forms of near-death experience. Some of them vivid, some of them are just very brief, but 20% have an NDE. Of these 20%, 80% go through an awareness of their body. They leave it, they see it, they look back at it, and they go, oh my goodness, I'm dead. They look around and they're interested in the world or the surroundings. And then they move through this tunnel of light. And they meet this being of light and they have their life review. That's the ones that are positive near-death experiences. 20% have what's called a negative near-death experience. And they are the ones that I'm going to talk about more in a second. Of these 20%, most of them have something called an inverted NDE. An inverted NDE is where they have the same imagery up here as a positive near-death experience, but yet they interpret it as though it's negative. And they're oftentimes already start their NDE with a lot of fear. There's also the void experience, where they enter into blackness and emptiness or nothingness, and they experience it not as peaceful, which is what these people would say. A lot of these people go through a black void too, but they experience it as peaceful. Instead, the negative ones experience it as scary. And then there's the last 10% down here that do have what's known as a hellish NDE, where there's a lot of imagery that is would be more typical of scenes from hell. I'll qualify what those are in a second. Okay. Normally, when people die, they check out of their body, or the 20% that have an NDE, they pop out of their body and they look around and they see their body. Maybe it's on the operating table, or maybe it's in a car crash, or maybe somebody murdered them. They pop out and they look around and they are aware of their surroundings, and they're aware that their body is there, and they feel the hearts, the emotions of everybody who's trying to help them. If it's a surgery team, they feel everybody in the surgery room. And then they start losing interest in the earthly plane, and they sort of like move up and up through the roof or outside the building, and they end up sometimes going through a dark place. And that dark place would be called the void. It's just, and they don't see any light there. It's just like darkness. Now, the people who, majority of them experience that as, oh, it's peaceful. Oh, this is warm. This is like a blanket enveloping me. It's a very pleasant experience. And then this little pinpoint of light shows up, and they start moving because they focus their attention on the light. They start moving towards the light, or the light comes to them, and then they just go up this tunnel, and they end up meeting the being of light, and they have a great life review, or they have a life review where they get to experience love and support, and then they come back. But there are some people that go into that void-like experience, and they are scared of it. It's very frightening to them. It's dark. It feels like nothingness to them. Sometimes a voice will show up and taunt them and ridicule them for believing that they ever existed, that anybody is real. And part of me wonders if that isn't their own voice talking to them, just debating within themselves. Maybe I didn't exist. Maybe all my friends never lived. Maybe all that was imagination. The earth and their memories of earth starts to fade. And so they basically freak out and think that there was no meaning to life. And they're tempted to, just go to despair, like, what was the point of all that? And then they end up back in their body. And what's interesting about them is they have what's known as a truncated near-death experience. A lot of negative, distressing near-death experiences are actually truncated, which means they end up back in their body before the next thing that could happen. And researchers theorize that if they had just stayed with the NDE and were allowed to keep living it out and didn't get sucked back into their body because somebody restarted their heart, that they would actually have positive things to say, that the story would change, their fears would subside, and that they would actually transition into the normal pathway of moving towards the light and having their life review. But if they don't, they can sometimes just go back into their body. Then they tell horrible stories of just blackness and nothingness, that and the light never showed up for them. And then there are people that have that void type experience, I think there's a subcategory where they actually lose desire. I covered this in my first video. If you've come from a background where there was abandonment, or I've seen this with some children that had NDEs, where they felt hopeless and they were just like faint of heart, as though nothing was in them to want anything. They end up in the near-death experience not wanting anything either. They sort of are lethargic and disinterested in the whole thing, and not believing anything good will happen. And they oftentimes have like an extended void experience where it just feels like it goes on and on and on. They would say for eternity or centuries or something. Well, everything up there feels like it's going on for centuries. Because it is the eternal state. It's not here. There's no time references. So when if you kind of are dead inside and resigned to life and you end up having an NDE, there could be very little story to it. It might not go on. What drives the story is you hunger for something more, that you don't like being where you're at, that you want something different. Then that's when the story changes and transitions happen and new things show up. But if you're just kind of lethargic and don't want anything, then you may be just living in this black existential void and nothing really interesting happens. Okay. I did want to go back and cover the inverted experience. It was the one on that chart. An inverted experience is where you have all of the same experiences of a positive one, but you interpret it as though it's negative. And these people are oftentimes surprised that they're outside of their body and shocked that there is an afterlife, and they get scared because they don't know what's going to happen, and they're maybe fearful of what's going to happen next, or that they go to a bad place. And so when the light shows up, instead of being gladly moving towards it and being drawn to it, they get real resistive. They dig in their heels. They start fearing everything. They shut down. They don't want anybody to interact with them. And this becomes a real problem for some of them. It can get really painful really quickly for people that basically resist the flow of their experience, that actually try and shut it down, and they basically go into a fetal position and stop trying to resist everything. And they eventually run out of energy. They eventually get exhausted. The power of the flow of conscious movement inside is so strong that it eventually breaks through, and they give up and they end up surrendering, and then they have a positive NDE, and then it goes well. They just sort of move on with the flow, and they understand that it's going to be okay and that there's nothing here to be afraid of, and they just go to the next part of their story, and the story unfolds. So those people have inverted NDEs. It's basically has all the good imagery, but they experience it as bad, partially out of fear of the unknown. And then for some of them, they really resist, and then it gets so bad that they eventually break and they have to give in to the experience, and then it moves and flows and gets a lot better for them. Okay, now let's talk about the third type of NDE, and that would be the distressing ones called hellish images. And what's interesting about these is it's oftentimes happens to people who entered their afterlife from a state of distress. Maybe they were cut open on an operating table, their heart was doing open heart surgery, and they're in and out of consciousness, and they're freaking out. They're not meant to pass. They were hoping to still live. And there's some cardiac surgeons, I'm thinking of one in particular, Maurice Rawlings, who described a lot of these in his stories about people telling him awful things that they saw and experienced. I am highly suspicious that they are really their soul is in a very perturbed, disturbed state, and that's why they're experiencing negative things. Not because that's really what it's going to happen like when they calm down, and that's really that they got assigned to some awful place. Because that's the problem with these videos, is you listen to them and you think, oh my God, there is a hell that's going to be all torture and God sent me there and it's permanent. No, nothing could be further from the truth. It's just that they went into the afterlife already highly disturbed or upset. Maybe they were murdered. Maybe they did a drug overdose. This is actually very common for drug overdoses too. Very common, where they're already trying to not kill themselves, but escape life. They're already miserable. They're hopeless. And then they end up in the NDE. And their imagery is sometimes hellish, where they feel like they went down, where they see other people who are also addicts that are clamoring and screaming or crying out, and they experience that as negative. And then there are people that have had particularly violent suicides where they were really angry and shot themselves in anger. They can end up seeing some negative imagery. Oftentimes because they're full of, hatred and anger, and they're trying to get back at somebody, they can end up having a negative NDE too. So it does, let me keep going. There's also a lot of Christians, believe it or not, that have negative NDEs that actually experience hellish imagery. And what's going on there, I think, is pretty clear. They're focused on hell. They're afraid of hell. They're thinking about hell. They're preoccupied with hell. And so they go to hell, or some version of it that they dream up. And it's like what is filling your heart at the moment you pass is kind of what you will experience in the next state initially. In the next afterlife is kind of what you will experience initially, is what's already preoccupying you. What your head is full of is what you will end up living when you're there initially. And then it transforms because you end up becoming bored of that, and you wonder if there's something else, and then you move on. But I actually see more Christians going to a hellish near-death experience than atheists. Atheists are oftentimes the ones that go right up and meet the being of light and find how much loved they are and feel how much the light is worth, and they want it and they want him, and then they go on and they have their life review. But if you are preoccupied or think that you should be in hell, or that you're afraid of being judged and that you will be judged, you may have a negative NDE. There is also people that are have a heart for a loved one that died that they're afraid is in hell. And these are people, oftentimes religious, that go and they look like they're like standing over hell, and they're looking at people walking towards, walking around, and they feel those people's despair and hopelessness. I don't know if those are real people that they're seeing, or if it's just what they are actually expecting to see, and therefore they see what they expect to see. It sort of, again, comes down to what we would say as psychologists, what you project upon the blank screen is what you will experience from the blank screen. It's kind of like what you say is going to be true is sort of what you experience until you no longer want it to be true, and then something else becomes true. There's also people with problematic belief systems that actually that become hyper-focused in some sort of retribution or punishment theology, and they can oftentimes end up, because that's where they live inside anyway, in this high alert, hyper-vigilant, a stressed state already, they end up going and having a negative experience. And they're not ready for the light. It's almost like the light hasn't had a chance to invite them. They don't even see it. They're not even aware of it. They just go into this, highly stressed, very negative state. And so, but lest you think that all people that have negative NDEs, it's because of this or that reason, because I did give a lot of explanations just then. There are perfectly loving, wonderful, saved people that have a negative NDE. And what's interesting about those is they're surprised. They don't know why they're there. They might feel lied to by their religion. My religion said that I wasn't supposed to be here. And what's interesting is some of them may forget their religion entirely. They may actually forget all of their training and their they may not even remember the Bible. They may just end up in a negative NDE. And I find what's interesting about that is it leads you to the conclusion that you can't trust that you know how to get out of it. That's the danger in trying to play the percentage game, where you're just saying, oh, I'll beat the percentages because only a certain few go to hell and see hellish imagery. And I would say that I could go to hell in this concept of having a distressing near-death experience just as easily as the next person, but it's not a permanent state. It's more like a test. It's almost like a question is being asked of you. What do you believe? And can you stay relaxed? And can you stay at peace? And can you hope for the good? And trust that the being of light who set up all of this after the afterlife, who set up the whole world after this world, is he good? Can you trust him? Because that is ultimately the one who will hear and see and know where you are. And we'll get to that in the next video about how do you get out of a distressing near-death experience if one happens to you. But I have heard of some people that were very loving and kind and believers, if you will. They had faith and they still had a negative NDE. So there is no guarantee. You can't play the odds of luck. Oh, I won't get that card. It'll be given to somebody else. It's like, well, it might happen to you too. Maybe there was something that needed to be worked out. And I'll get to that in the next video too, about what is oftentimes meant by these negative NDEs and how do we understand them and what's really going on. Regarding the hellish imagery, there is a lot that can be said about what they don't see. Nobody sees Satan. He doesn't exist. He's not there. There is very few that ever see the lake of fire that I actually believe. And if they see the lake of fire and people burning in torment in the lake of fire, oftentimes those are sensational. They're not true. Those are just people making it up. But the most that does come up, and it comes up fairly often, is they always experience going down. They might see like a hole in the ground, and then they descend as a little soul through that hole, and then they might see the top of the cave of what they would describe as hell. A lot of people have said that, and they're told while they're descending, don't come here. This place isn't for you. You don't belong here. Other times they descend into that hole in the ground. Think of it as a big cavern, and they just kind of descend as a little soul into this huge empty place. Other times there might be Howard Storm. I'm referring to his near-death experience. He described other souls that were clamoring for him to join them, and that they were kind of viciously wanting him to become part of their group and to be part of their hell, if you will. And that's when he started realizing, I know I don't belong here. You guys aren't the same type of person I am in. And then he started praying and he got out. He went to a different place. One thing that oftentimes happens is these spirits, if you do encounter any in a hellish imagery, they don't like it when you sing or praise God or pray. They instantly disappear, and then you basically are left back in the world of light. The being of light comes and gets you, and you then get to experience a positive NDE. Notice that I'm saying these things change, that there's oftentimes sequences to these stories and transformations as you go through these experiences. The near-death experiences that are negative, the most imagery you get, the most common, is they're stuck on a cave somewhere. They might smell sulfur. They might hear a scream in the distance. They might be aware that there's despair in the presence somewhere in the room. They might see smoke a little bit. But nobody is actually actively getting tortured. Nobody is actively in pain. It's just the impression of it. It's just the feeling. Remember, the afterlife is all about feeling states, and these go through you. It's just something like you become aware of. It's like you're observing, you're listening, you're hearing it, and then you have a choice to make. Is that something you're going to dwell on? Is that some place you want to be? And then it's kind of like you then get to answer the question of, well, what do I want? And then you get to go to where your wants take you, which is what I covered in my first video. Okay, I think that's pretty much everything. Let me just... if I were to say that there are principles here that we could learn, there are several that we could say. Most negative NDEs are simply truncated, which means that it stopped too soon. People maybe entered the afterlife in a distressed state, and so they ended up having a fearful emotion to begin with, and so they started experiencing fear. Other people were already full of fear from their religious belief system, so they expected something bad to happen. Other people were just resisting the light and didn't want to go to the light, or were afraid of the light, and so nothing happened. They just sort of stayed in the void. There is the purpose of this series is just to encourage you actually to know that if you end up in a bad place, there are things you can do to actually move on to a good place. Relaxing, going ahead and putting your soul at ease is going to be very helpful. I'll cover that all in the next video, and then we will conclude this video with a quote I think that Jesus said that I thought was very helpful. In Luke chapter 12, Luke 12:32, Jesus said, "Do not be afraid, little flock, for our Father has chosen to gladly give you the kingdom." It is God's desire that you experience good things. I think one of the blessings of the Christian message is that He came from the afterlife to this life to tell us the good news that the afterlife is ready and waiting for us. And for people that have had these negative near-death experiences, I would just encourage you that it is likely you didn't get the whole picture. That was just a moment. That was just a part of a story that was going to unfold. There were going to be many more levels and stages and chapters to that story. You just hadn't got to them yet. Okay, I'm going to close this now. Join me for the next two videos. I think they will be very helpful and will explain a lot more about what's really going on in distressing near-death experiences. Okay, bye.